Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we shall now begin the interactive dialogue with Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, who will present his report. The list of speakers will close in 15 minutes. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Muhammad Abdul Salam Babikir. Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my honor to be here today to present my report to the Council on the situation of human rights in Eritrea. The report covers the period from 29th of April 2021 to 22 of April 2022 and focuses on the latest developments on the central human rights issues. Excellencies, since I started my mandate in November 2020, I have not received any evidence of progress in the human rights situation in Eritrea. In fact, I have observed a deterioration in several areas. The involvement of Eritrea in the armed conflict in Ethiopia has brought to the fore the persistent human rights violations linked to the system of indefinite national military service, and further compounded the already dire internal human rights situation in Eritrea. Those who attempt to evade the draft are imprisoned in inhumane and degrading conditions for indefinite periods of time. The authorities also punish draft evaders by proxy, for example, by imprisoning a parent or a spouse in order to force them to surrender themselves. I also received reports about the conscripts who were killed as they tried to escape from Tigray or from military training centers in Eritrea. GIFA, or rounds-ups for the purpose of military conscription, have dramatically intensified across the country. Thousands of conscripts have been forced to participate in the Tigray conflict, with men, women and children being swept up and sent to fight in the front lines. Previously documented patterns of child recruitment by Eritrean forces have worsened, with witnesses referring to the roundup of children as young as 14. Refugees who had been kidnapped from Hetsas and Shemelba camps in Ethiopia in late 2020 have also been detained, punished, and conscripted. Over the past year, I have heard from dozens of Eritreans whose relatives had been forced to fight in Tigray. Their families had not received any official information about their fate or their whereabouts and live in fear that they may never return. The dismal human rights situation in Eritrea continued to push thousands to flee the country. At the same time, Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers face increasingly restrictive asylum and migratory policies, both in transit and destination countries. Eritrean asylum seekers are still being detained, refueled, and denied access to the asylum process in many countries. They face unspeakable violations and hardship in their journey to reach safety. The situation of unaccompanied children is particularly alarming. Much more needs to be done to protect Eritrean refugees and asylum seekers globally. I'm particularly concerned about the situation of Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia, where thousands remain in grave danger. I continue to receive reports of Eritrean refugees killed in attacks, as well as of preventable causes linked to access to food, water, and medicine in Tigray. This is an urgent matter that requires immediate action to protect refugees and other vulnerable populations. I welcome the efforts of the Ethiopian Refugees and Returnees Service and UNHCR to register and assist Eritrean refugees, and note with concern the difficulties that humanitarian actors are facing to operate in the Tigray region. The role of Eritrean forces is impeding the delivery of humanitarian assistance to refugees and other populations in need in Tigray for several months is actually of grave concern. Eritrea made no progress towards the development of a minimum institutional structure able to protect and to ensure respect for human rights. Eritrea continues to lack rule of law and national assembly, to develop and enact laws and regulations, and an independent judiciary. The lack of independent rule of law institutions and of proper administration of justice has actually far-reaching consequences for the protection of human rights and deprive Eritreans of the right to access justice. While in the context of the 2019 Universal Periodic Review, Eritrea agreed to strengthen the administration of justice, agreed to address impunity for human rights violations, and to ensure respect for due process rights. However, no progress has been made in this regard with regard to the implementation of the UPR recommendations. Conditions of detention in Eritrea amounts to inhumane and degrading treatment. Detainees are held in severely overcrowded spaces, unsafe and unsanitary conditions, and without access to water, sanitation. Food is also scarce and inadequate, and access to medical attention is minimal. I received information about detainees whose situations severely deteriorated as a result of lack of medical attention. Some actually have died while waiting to receive treatment. I remain gravely concerned by the situation of hundreds of Eritreans who have been disappeared and arbitrarily detained in secret prisons in violation of human rights standards. I continue to hear testimonies from witnesses and victims who were held and tortured in places known as villas. These are actually secret places of detention that cannot be readily identified. This practice continued to be widespread during the mandate period. I urge Eritrea to reveal the whereabouts of victims of enforced disappearance and to develop a transparent and efficient system for the registration of detainees. Civic space in Eritrea remains under the complete control of the authorities. The People's Front of Democracy and Justice, PFDJ, continues to be the only authorized party. There is no independent media. Eritrea remains one of the most censored countries in the world. A group of 16 journalists, including Swedish Eritrean journalist and a writer, Daud Isaac, have now been disappeared for 20 years, making them the longest detained journalists in the world. There is also no information regarding the 11 former members of the government known as the G15, detained since 2001. After a wave of releases of Christian prisoners in 2020 and early 2021, these positive steps were reversed during the reporting period with the arrest of at least 47 Christians. 20 Jehovah's Witnesses also remained imprisoned. And I call on the government of Eritrea to release those imprisoned for their religious beliefs and allow all Eritreans to exercise the right to freedom of religion. I welcome the adoption of a new Eritrean UN Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, as well as the invitation extended to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to conduct visit in May 2022. While this renewed trend of cooperation with some agencies and mechanisms of the United Nations system is a positive sign, these efforts actually must be accompanied by tangible improvements in the enjoyment and fulfillment of the human rights of Eritreans. Urgent action is required to address wide human rights violations, including arbitrary detention, enforced disappearance, torture, inhumane or degrading treatment, and indefinite conscription. In October 2021, Eritrea was re-elected to serve in the Human Rights Council. As a member of the Council, Eritrea should uphold the highest standard in the promotion and protection of human rights and fully cooperate with the Council, including its special procedures. Eritrea demonstrated lack of will to implement the recommendations of human rights mechanism, including recommendations issued through the Universal Periodic Review process, and also recommendations by treaty bodies as well as Council mandate mechanism. This actually puts the credibility and integrity of this Council in jeopardy. Finally, I regret that the government of Eritrea continues to oppose my mandate and that I have not yet had the opportunity to visit the country or to meet the authorities. My request in January 2021 and August 2021 to undertake an official visit to Eritrea remain unanswered. On 26th of April 2022, a draft report was shared with the government of Eritrea in order to provide it with an opportunity to comment on the observations and findings. Unfortunately, the authorities did not respond. I emphasize that my mandate is in service of the rights of Eritreans, and that my only agenda is making progress on the human rights situation in the country. I hope that the government will revisit its current position and consider engaging in a constructive dialogue with me, and once again I express my availability, my willingness to work with the government of Eritrea to address the persistent human rights challenges in the country. Thank you.
I thank you, Special Rapporteur. According to our practice, we shall start by hearing from the delegation of the country concerned. I now give the floor to the representative of Eritrea. You have the 5 minutes, please.
Mr. President, the mandate was established in 2012 as a continuation of the external threats pursued by a core group of Western countries with a hardline position on Eritrea. Accordingly, harassment tools, including the UN sanction imposed on Eritrea in the pretext of Eritrea's support to Al-Shabaab, were applied to make Eritrea malleable and accept their diktat, especially on the Eritrean-Ethiopian Boundary Commission international award that they wanted to illegally alter at the expense of its territorial integrity and sovereignty. In this context, the Special Rapporteur, complemented by the Commission of Inquiry on Eritrea until it was retracted after 2 years, had been established to vilify, isolate and destabilize Eritrea and serve as a continuation of conflict in the Horn of Africa. The TPLF minority government in Ethiopia served this ill intent until it was ousted from power in 2018, ushering a new dynamics of peace. The fact is, however, that human rights is mainstreamed in Eritrea's nation building, but like any nation, Eritrea faces human rights challenge which the government continuously works to address. But there is no human rights crisis that warrants the treatment of Eritrea under Human Rights Council special mandate, as any challenge can be better be addressed through the EPR. On the onset, the rapporteur has devoted again substantial portion of the report to the situation in the Tigray region on Ethiopia beyond his mandate, and thus my delegation will not respond to any part of the extraneous report. We deeply regret that the mandate holder took the position to attack the National Service Program, which is the backbone of the defense forces, to undermine the right of self-defense and the right to live in peace without any threats. In a sense, the report at hand, as usual, lacks objectivity and is compounded by failures that violate the Code of Conduct of Special Procedures. Moreover, it is irresponsible that the Special Rapporteur again comes with unsubstantiated information from selected, anonymous and dubious sources through remote monitoring, aiming to level baseless allegations previously clarified and rejected, and Eritrea will not respond again to these outrageous allegations. After the restoration of the Eritrea-Ethiopia peace in 2018, with implication to the revitalization of the Horn of Africa regional dynamics, the Tigray crisis has been invented to abort this new dynamics and reassert the US and Western allies' geopolitical agendas in the new reality of the shifting global order. Simultaneous failed insurrectional attacks were thus waged to change the Eritrean government and in parallel reinstate the TPLF clique back into power. Furthermore, in the context of the law enforcement measure taken by the Ethiopian government, the Tigray crisis has been exploited for scapegoating Eritrea through unfounded human rights allegations, including obstruction of humanitarian assistance by Eritrean forces. Eritrea rejects these allegations and opposes the coverage of the Tigray crisis in the report, as the mandate deals on the human rights situation in Eritrea. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Special Rapporteur at hand is again crafted only to level the ground for the continuation of the unfair and unjust mandate which has not created any dividend, and my delegation thus calls on delegates to 1. acknowledge and support Eritrea's ground reality and its modest effort to consolidate the emerging regional dynamics of peace, security and development in the Horn of Africa. Oppose any draft resolution aiming at the extension of the mandate. 3. Support the ongoing Eritrea CPR process and implementation. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you, Excellency. I would like to inform that the list of speakers is now closed. I now invite interested delegations to ask questions of the Special Rapporteur and to make comments on his report. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Iceland on behalf of a group of countries.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. I have the honour to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic Baltic countries. We thank the Special Rapporteur for his report. We remain deeply concerned over persistent human rights violations in Eritrea, in particular the practice of indefinite national service, arbitrary detention, enforced disappearances, and widespread sexual and gender-based violence. We condemn the continuing involvement of Eritrea in the war in Ethiopia, including reports of the deployment of child soldiers and forced conscription of Eritrean refugees. We urge the government to immediately and unconditionally withdraw Eritrean forces from Ethiopia and to investigate all alleged breaches of international law by Eritrean actors in Ethiopia. We also condemn severe restrictions on the rights to freedom of expression and religion or belief and the continued closure of civic space in Eritrea. We call on the Eritrean government to release all those arbitrarily detained, to end the practices of prolonged incommunicado and arbitrary detention, and to develop independent rule of law institutions to protect human rights. Finally, as a member of the Human Rights Council, Eritrea should uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights and fully cooperate with the Council's mechanisms, including by granting the Special Rapporteur full and unhindered access to the country. I thank you.
I thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of European Union.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank the rapporteur and call on Eritrea to cooperate with his mandate. We call on the government to respect human rights and the rule of law, release all prisoners held for political or religious reasons, and end all arbitrary and incommunicado detention, enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, and the practice of indefinite national service, including the reported conscription of children. We further call on Eritrea to guarantee the exercise of freedoms of expression, religion and belief, and peaceful assembly and association, as well as land and property rights, including of foreign communities. The oppressive environment in Eritrea has forced many to seek refuge abroad. We condemn the attempts to silence dissent abroad by punishing family members who remain in Eritrea. It is imperative that Eritrean troops withdraw from Ethiopian territory. We call on Eritrea to cooperate with international investigations regarding IHL violations and human rights violations and abuses committed in northern Ethiopia, and are ready to support Eritrea in its cooperation with human rights mechanisms. Finally, the EU deplores Eritrea's stance with regard to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Dr. Babika, how can the international community best assist you in monitoring the human rights situation in Eritrea? Thank you.
Thank you, Excellency. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Vice President. France would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his annual report and aligns itself with the statement given by the European Union. Once again, the report shows that no tangible progress in terms of the protection of human rights has been achieved by the Eritrean authorities. And Eritrea is a member of this Council, and therefore it is incumbent upon it to take its responsibilities seriously. The first signs of openness for dialogue with the United Nations do not shield the reality, which is a lack of credible commitment to the respect for human rights. Eritrea is party to a number of international conventions, including the Convention Against Torture and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and against arbitrary detentions. Yet we see that acts of torture and secret detention, sexual harassment, sexual abuse, forced work continue in a climate of generalised impunity. Vice President, the situation in Eritrea should continue to be carefully monitored, and we would call on members of this Council to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur, because this is an indispensable tool to ensure the monitoring of the human rights situation in Eritrea. We would urge that the Eritrean authorities allow a visit for the Special Rapporteur on the ground in order to gather first-hand information. I thank you.
Je vous remercie. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Luxembourg.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Luxembourg aligns itself with the statement given by the European Union. We would like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his oral update, and we would add our voice to those encouraging the government of Eritrea to cooperate with him and to give him unhampered access to the country. As a member of the Human Rights Council, Eritrea must observe the strictest rules in terms of the promotion and defence of human rights. This includes cooperation with the mechanisms of the United Nations. These are available to the government of Eritrea to support it and accompany it in implementing reforms, including the recommendations of the UPR. The indefinite military service, mass arrests and searches, rounding up conscripts, are these practices condemn the majority of the Eritrean population to live in a very difficult situation. They should remove their troops from the Tigray area and comply with the international calls to give account for violations in the north. We would renew our call to all parties in the conflict to respect the humanitarian corridors. All should have access to humanitarian assistance and food aid. Thank you.
Je vous remercie. Je donne la parole.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Vice-Président.
Mr. Vice President, Switzerland should like to thank the Special Rapporteur for his update. My country is concerned at the situation of human rights in Eritrea against a volatile and fragile humanitarian security context. In spite of this ceasefire declared in March in the Tigray, violent clashes between the Eritrean army and Tigrayan forces have been noted. Switzerland shares the concerns of the Special Rapporteur regarding the urgent need to reform in the mandatory military service. Furthermore, Switzerland would encourage Eritrea to promote women's rights and combat all forms of violence all forms of gender-based violence. My country would call on Eritrea to cooperate with the mechanisms of this Council in order to improve respect for human rights in the country. Switzerland would therefore encourage Eritrea to authorise a visit of the Special Rapporteur and to improve access for international organisations and diplomatic representation in all of the country. Special Rapporteur, how can progress be made into inquiries and human rights violations committed as part of national service or military service? I thank you.
Je vous remercie.
I thank you. I recognise the representative of Djibouti, please.
Thank you, Chair. Djibouti thanks the Special Rapporteur. My government remains committed to the peace and reconciliation dynamics of 2019 in our region and believes that the commitment and engagement of all countries can strengthen regional integration. Mr. Chair, Djibouti takes note of the conclusion and recommendation contained in the report, in particular the ones aimed at putting an end to the practice of prolonged incommunicado and arbitrary detentions in secret places, creating effective and transparent mechanisms for the registration of detainees and establishing appropriate monitoring mechanisms to prevent torture and inhumane or degrading treatment. Furthermore, the report by the Special Rapporteur regarding Eritrean prisoners' ill treatment without any consideration to their human rights and basic due process increases Djibouti's concern related to the Djiboutian prisoners of war detained incommunicado in Eritrea. Since last year, my delegation preoccupation raised before the HRC has not been addressed by Eritrea. Indeed, my delegation remains deeply concerned by the lack of information on the remaining Djiboutian prisoners unaccounted for and held incommunicado in Eritrean custody, and call on Eritrea to share the information on their fate with relevant stakeholders, including the ICRC. Djibouti firms believe that the normalization of relations between Djibouti and Eritrea, if sustained by meaningful and genuine engagement by both sides, shall contribute to solve the issue related to the fate of these prisoners. The Special Rapporteur, the OHCR, and the HRC are encouraged to continue engaging positively with Eritrea in order to promote and protect the human rights of all in the country. Thank you, Chairperson.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba.
Señor Presidente.
President, cooperation, dialogue and respectful exchange of views among all countries on the basis of the principles of the UN Charter are the best way of promoting and protecting human rights. This should also be the mechanism used by the Council to address issues of concern for the international community or that can be challenges for one of the countries in creating an environment that is conducive to achieving all human rights. All of this should oppose any politicisation, selectivity and double standards in tackling human rights. Mr. President, the Council should not stop exploring and promoting cooperation and constructive, respectful dialogue with Eritrea. The resolution that gives the mandate to this dialogue does not have the acceptance of the country concerned and thus undermines the principles that should govern this Council. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Venezuela.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. Just like a year ago, once again, we have to hear a hostile report on Eritrea with invariably partialised information riddled with unfounded accusations, just like all the other reports presented since the imposition of this Special Rapporteur in 2012. Venezuela does not support these mandates created against countries of the South, and less so when they're rejected by the country concerned, because this undermines the sacred principles of respect and sovereignty and non-interference in the domestic affairs of states that are enshrined in the UN Charter. Eritrea has given credible signs of cooperation with this Council, its mechanisms and treaty bodies, providing timely information on the efforts undertaken by the country to protect fundamental rights. We must overcome these flawed patterns of interference, supporting Eritrea in applying the recommendations accepted by the UPR, which is the mechanism that has shown itself to be efficient in tackling human rights issues on an equal footing amongst all states. It's time to halt this mandate imposed on Eritrea, which has led to a lost decade with no more results than a squandering of meagre resources. We would reiterate the need that this Council comply with its mandate to promote and protect human rights in the world on the basis of genuine dialogue and cooperation, which are the fundamental pillars of its work. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Australia.
Australia thanks the Special Rapporteur for his oral update and urges the Government of Eritrea to cooperate fully with his mandate. We are gravely concerned by Eritrea's involvement in the Ethiopian conflict and reports of human rights violations and abuses, including the forced returns of Eritrean refugees. We call on Eritrea to investigate all alleged human rights violations committed by its troops during the conflict, including deeply concerning allegations of rape and other sexual and gender-based violence. Australia remains concerned by ongoing reports of forced labour, child labour and prolonged compulsory national service. We call on Eritrea to cease the recruitment and use of children and allow them to their right to life and education. We are concerned by continuing restrictions on freedom of association, expression and religion or belief. We call on the Government of Eritrea to immediately release all prisoners detained for their religious beliefs or for exercising their right to freedom of expression or assembly. We reaffirm our support for the Special Rapporteur's mandate and ask how the Special Rapporteur is coordinating with the Commission of Human Rights experts on Ethiopia in its investigation. We thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Sudan.
شكرا السيد نائب الرئيس. في البدء يود وفد بلاد الترحيب بوفد.
First, the delegation of my country would like to welcome the delegation of Eritrea and express our appreciation for you taking part in the work of the Council. We also welcome the Special Rapporteur. The delegation of my country would like to reiterate the importance of strengthening human rights in all countries. To do this, We need to avoid any politicization or selectivity. We also reaffirm that it's important to respect national sovereignty and integrity. And it's important to listen to the views of this country regarding cooperation with different countries and the human rights mechanisms. The delegation of my country would like to commend Eritrea for its cooperation with the human rights mechanism.
Mr.
Vice President, we oppose the politicized consideration of the situation in Eritrea. The establishment and extension of mechanisms that are not supported by the country in question do not improve the human rights situation on the ground. The mandate of the Special Rapporteur on Eritrea is a clear example of this. Instead of seeking opportunities for interaction, the Special Rapporteur has chosen a confrontational form of dialogue and has filled his report with accusatory rhetoric. We are puzzled by the Special Rapporteur supporting the sanctions support by the U.S. on Eritrea. We remind you that peacekeeping operations are having a negative effect on the human rights situation, which has been mentioned several times, including UNSC resolutions. We must also express that it is unacceptable that the Special Rapporteur is exceeding his mandate and including the Tigray region in his report. We think it is unacceptable also that the SR is attempting to essentially rob the state of its sovereign right to express its position in the HRC. We are not in agreement with his conclusion that Eritrea has used its membership in the Council to counteract international investigations. We remind you that resolutions 47/13 and S33/1, which the mandate holder refers to, were opposed not only by Eritrea, but also by over a dozen states who have thus expressed their opinion of the politicized activity of this special procedure. We would like to highlight that Eritrea is successfully cooperating with a number of institutions and mechanisms in the framework of the UN. It actively participated in the third UPR cycle. We call on all states and human rights mechanisms to structure their work with this African country in a spirit of cooperation and considering its legitimate interests. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Ethiopia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have noted the report of the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, Dr. Mohamed Abdisalam Babakar. Mr. President, it is to be recalled that the Council resolution establishing this mandate have limited the scope of the Special Rapporteur to the situation of human rights in Eritrea. We, however, note with regret that the Special Rapporteur in his latest report has once again exceeded his mandate by leveling baseless allegations against Ethiopia in relation of the broader humanitarian situation and protection of people of concern, as well as focusing on regional developments. The government of Ethiopia has been expediting humanitarian aid to people in need in assistance in Tigray, Amhara, Afar, and Afar regions. The declaration of the humanitarian truce has helped to improve the flow of aid. As one of the largest refugee hosting countries, the government has also continued to provide protection to refugees hosted in the country, including in the northern part of Ethiopia. The government has also strengthened its collaboration with the UNHCR and other humanitarian agencies in the provision of humanitarian assistance. We, however, have noted with serious concern that the Special Rapporteur has included unfounded allegations in his report. He has not exercised his function in accordance with his mandate and has violated the Code of Conduct for mandate holders. It is thus imperative for this Council to remind the Special Rapporteur to focus exclusively on the implementation of his mandate. It is also high time that the Human Rights Council considers terminating this mandate. I thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Saudi Arabia.
شكرا السيد الرئيس لقد أخذنا علما
Thank you, Vice President. We have taken note of the oral report on the human rights situation in Eritrea presented by the Special Rapporteur. We have also taken note of the resolutions and conclusions. Vice President, as the representative of Eritrea has mentioned, this country is undergoing a difficult situation and they require understanding from the international community, and my country will spare no effort to guarantee stability and security in Eritrea, both generally and on a more global level. We commend the efforts by Eritrea to rectify the human rights situation, and we would hope that Eritrea could meet the aspirations of its people. My country is determined to pursue an active role in the international community to promote dialogue. Our delegation commends the Special Rapporteur's report and note that the UPR is the right mechanism to evaluate the human rights situation in all countries, including Eritrea, in a spirit of cooperation and dialogue, which will enable us to strengthen the rule of law. Thank you. Human rights. Thank you.
Of China.
Mr. President, China appreciates efforts by the government of Eritrea to promote economic and social development, strive to eliminate poverty and raise people's living standard, and actively implement recommendations accepted in the UPR. Certain countries have taken used CMs which undermine human rights in Eritrea. These should be lifted immediately. We understand the challenges facing Eritrea in the promotion and protection of human rights under the impact of the pandemic. China has always called for dialogue and cooperation for the promotion and protection of human rights. We are against politicization and instrumentalization of human rights, or using it as a pretext to interfere in other countries' internal affairs. Eritrea and countries in the region are all against the continued establishment of a special rapporteur on Eritrea, and which would exacerbate confrontation in the Council and consume precious UN resources. The Special Rapporteur's report also addresses the Tigray issue, which goes beyond his mandate. We express our concern over that. All countries should constructively cooperate and provide Eritrea with help in accordance with its need, with its will. Thank you.
Korea.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The DPRK delegation is of the view that any debate based on prejudice and aimed at political objectives is not conducive but counterproductive to the genuine promotion and protection of human rights, and therefore such practice should be discontinued. The genuine willingness and preparedness of the government of Eritrea for the promotion and protection of human rights and efforts to that end should be duly taken into account and further encouraged. The HRC and OHCHR should avoid the application of politicization, selectivity, and double standards in the fields of human rights, and encourage the constructive dialogue and cooperation to promote the understanding of the different realities and to explore effective ways for the promotion and protection of human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative of Belarus.
We would once again like to reiterate that Belarus does not support the adoption of country-specific resolutions, the establishment of country-specific mandates without the consent of the countries in question. We stress that country-specific resolutions in the HRC are political initiatives, and country mandates are subordinate to the interests of a group of Western states. We express our disagreement with the discussion of the human rights situation in Eritrea at every session of the HRC. The last discussion was 3 months ago. We believe the sponsors of the resolution on Eritrea
провалов в сфере прав человека. Давайте лучше послушаем Латвию, Литву, Польшу, Чехию, Эстонию, что у них с гиперинфляцией, или как они обращались с просителями убежища, или, может, объяснять свои нападки на русскоязычное население и его дискриминацию. Очередной доклад по Эритрее не выдерживает никакой критики. Методику его подготовки на основе дистанционного мониторинга признаем и ставим.
We do not recognize this methodology based on remote monitoring. We question its entire content. The Special Rapporteur's visits to Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden, and...
As I understood. Could I ask to to repeat the video and to provide English translation also.
Вновь хотели бы подтвердить.
We would once again like to reiterate that Belarus does not support the adoption of country-specific resolutions and the establishment of country-specific mandates without the consent of the governments of the states in question. We stress that country-specific resolutions in the HRC are political initiatives and country mandates are subordinate to the interests of a group of Western states. We express our opposition to the discussion of the human rights situation in Eritrea at every session of the HRC. The last discussion was 3 months ago. We believe that the sponsors of the resolution on Eritrea are thus being deceitful and evading the discussion of their own failures in human rights. In fact, let's rather listen to what Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Estonia have to say about hyperinflation or how they treat asylum seekers. Perhaps they could explain their attacks on the Russian-speaking population and discrimination against them. Yet another report on Eritrea does not stand up to criticism. We do not recognize its methodology, which is based on remote monitoring. We question the entire content. The Special Rapporteur's visits to Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden, his thanks to them for their support only reinforce our doubt about the impartiality of the mandate. We are convinced that Eritrea does not need to be lectured by Western states and the Special Rapporteur.
Thank you. Now I give the floor to the representative for Sri Lanka.
Mr. President, Sri Lanka opposes mandates of this Council that do not enjoy the consent of the country concerned. Such mandates only serve to polarize and divide, and as such are unproductive. The work of this Council should be based on the guiding principles in the General Assembly Resolution 60/251 and the IB package. We encourage this Council to appreciate the realities and challenges faced by Eritrea on the ground. Eritrea continues to constructively engage with this Council and the UN system, and an invitation had been extended to the High Commissioner for Human Rights to visit the country. The efforts of the government of Eritrea to promote and protect human rights should be recognized and encouraged. Sri Lanka reiterates that principles of sovereign equality, respect for territorial integrity and non-interference should guide the work of this Council, and that human rights issues must be addressed through cooperation and mutual respect. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU and thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. The situation of human rights in Eritrea continues to be of great concern. We are deeply troubled by the widespread impunity for past and ongoing human rights violations, including arbitrary arrests and incommunicado detention, enforced disappearances, sexual and gender-based violence, forced labour and restrictions on the media and the civic space. Ireland is concerned by the efforts of the Eritrean government to control the activities of the Eritrean diaspora, many of whom have sought refuge abroad due to the dire human rights situation. We condemn the use of intimidation and reprisals against members of the diaspora as well as their families. Ireland calls on the government of Eritrea to immediately release all those arbitrarily detained and end its cruel policy of indefinite military conscription. We again call for the total withdrawal of Eritrean armed forces from northern Ethiopia and emphasise the need for accountability for violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law committed by Eritrean troops. We call on the government of Eritrea, as a member of this Council, to uphold the highest standards in the promotion and protection of human rights by urgently engaging with human rights mechanisms, including the Special Rapporteur, and undertake tangible reforms. Special Rapporteur, how can the international community and Member States support Eritrean human rights defenders and civil society organisations in their invaluable work promoting human rights? Thank you.
I thank you. I invite distinguished representative of United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. The United Kingdom thanks the Special Rapporteur for his work and his report on the human rights situation in Eritrea, which remains deeply concerning. We take this opportunity to again urge Eritrea to take steps to address long-standing human rights concerns expressed by this Council, including prioritising national service reform, releasing all those in arbitrary detention, and guaranteeing the freedom of religion or belief for all faiths and the freedom of expression and association. And we call on Eritrea to cooperate with the mandate of the Special Rapporteur. We're also disappointed by the continued lack of progress from Eritrea in implementing recommendations it accepted during its last Universal Periodic Review. We called on them to do so as a priority. Mr Vice President, we continue to urge the Eritrean government to engage constructively with the recommendations of the 3rd November UN Ethiopian Human Rights Commission Joint Investigation Report. We also urge them to work both with the Human Rights Council mandated mechanism of 17 December 2021 to investigate and redress the human rights violations and abuses committed during the conflict in Ethiopia. We are concerned that the recent increased tensions on the border between Eritrea and the Tigray region of Ethiopia could lead to further conflict, putting already vulnerable civilian populations at even greater risk. We would expect all sides to the conflict in northern Ethiopia to respect international human rights and international humanitarian law. Special Rapporteur, will you consider engaging with the International Commission of Human Rights Experts to share best practice, analysis and insight on engaging on human rights in Eritrea? Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the Distinguished Representative of Yemen.
Mr. President, we have read the report submitted by the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Eritrea, and we would like to underline that the work of human rights should be based on a true methodology on the basis of dialogue and cooperation with the concerned country and avoiding politicization and selectivity. The reports from the mandate holders should be predicated on sources of information that have been verified while taking into account the characteristics and specificities of each country. We also underline the importance of adhering to the basic principles upon which the Human Rights Council has been built, that is, to cooperate with governments, and therefore it is necessary to take the opinion of the government of Eritrea into account on the methodology and the form of cooperation that could be between the government of Eritrea and human rights mechanisms. We greatly value the efforts of the government of Eritrea to strengthen human rights despite the challenges and difficulties faced by that country. We would like to thank Eritrea for its cooperation with regional and international bodies. We call upon Eritrea to continue those efforts and that cooperation. I thank you, sir. Shukran.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. Burundi is seriously concerned with the fact that the Human Rights Council is becoming more and more politicized. That's reports based on disinformation brings into disrepute the Human Rights Council as far as its principles are concerned. Only selectivity, double standards, and politicization should be replaced by international cooperation and dialogue, and it is the best way to promote and protect human rights in all countries. Selectivity, double standards, and politicization of human rights only worsens the situation and discredits this institution and is counterproductive. In conclusion, my country urges the international community and the Human Rights Council to cooperate in full transparency in the analysis of human rights questions in different countries. Thank you.
Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much.
Give the floor to the Distinguished Representative of Iran for video statement.
Mr. President, we would like to reiterate that the Council should fulfill its mandate on promotion and protection of human rights on the basis of dialogue and cooperation. The country-specific resolutions that are not supported by the concerned countries are counterproductive for the protection and promotion of human rights and hamper the principles of universality, objectivity, and non-selectivity in the consideration of human rights issues. They also will undermine the spirit of cooperation and constructive engagement that should be the only guiding role for the work of this Council. Mr. President, Eritrea has actively cooperated with the Council and its mechanisms, in particular through providing credible information about its efforts in promoting and protection of human rights of its people. We note the level of commitment conveyed by the government of Eritrea to cooperate with OHCHR and to implement its obligations to promote and protect human rights. The international community should recognize that commitment and appreciate this constructive path. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States of America.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President and Special Rapporteur Babeker. The United States condemns actions reportedly committed by Eritrea, including the arrests of individuals merely for exercising their freedoms of expression, religion, or belief, and peaceful assembly, as well as those who legitimately claim conscientious objector status from compulsory or indefinite national service. The United States continues to be alarmed at Eritrea's involvement in the conflict in northern Ethiopia. We remain gravely concerned that Eritrean government forces there have reportedly committed human rights abuses, including arbitrary killings, torture, rape, and other forms of sexual violence, including against children. We also remain deeply disturbed by reports that Eritrean forces have forcibly returned Eritrean refugees in Ethiopia to Eritrea. We call for the government of Eritrea to hold accountable those responsible for human rights abuses and violations. I thank you very much.
I thank you. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. At the outset, Somalia would like to welcome the Special Rapporteur as well as the distinguished delegation of the State of Eritrea at this interactive dialogue. We take note of the contents of the report and also the comments made by the distinguished representative of Eritrea. Somalia particularly wishes to underline numerous positive steps undertaken by the government of Eritrea inter alia, the recent partnership with the United Nations Sustainable Development Cooperation Framework, the invitation addressed to the Office of the High Commissioner to conduct a country visit, as well as the positive and active engagement of its last Universal Periodic Review. Mr. Vice President, these measures demonstrate once again the determination and willingness of the government of Eritrea to enhance the situation of human rights in the country and to promote the economic, social, cultural and environmental rights of its citizens with the aim of eradicating the extreme poverty and to increasing the standard of living of the population, including minority and vulnerable groups. With this spirit of commitment, this Council should recognize and encourage this positive change by providing assistance which is in conformity with the needs and the priorities of the government of Eritrea. I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. We shall now turn to the list of speakers for non-governmental organizations. I give the floor to the representative of Christian Solidarity Worldwide. Please.
Thank you, Mr. President. CSW thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. It is regrettable that despite its Council membership, Eritrea still will not cooperate with his mandate and has limited engagement with other Council mechanisms, even as its troops are implicated in violations which may amount to atrocity crimes in neighbouring Ethiopia. Also regrettable is the continuing lack of tangible progress towards resolving its human rights crisis. We urge Eritrea to use the privilege of Council membership to engage positively with special procedures and advance the rights and freedoms of its citizens. We also call for the immediate withdrawal of its troops from Ethiopia and full cooperation with the International Commission of Human Rights experts. Arbitrary detention of religious adherents continues. In March 2022, 29 Christians were arrested in a raid on a prayer meeting in a house in Asmara and detained in Mysara prison. In May, 17 more Christians were arrested while praying and taken to Mysara. There were reportedly arrests at several monasteries following the death in custody of Patriarch Antonios in February 2022, and 5 Orthodox priests arrested in June 2019 for supporting him remain detained. This month, Tisigeweni Makonnen Haile, mother of 6 and wife of one of 3 Orthodox clergy detained incommunicado since 2004, died on the 5th of June without having seen her husband. 20 Jehovah's Witnesses remain detained indefinitely. The community is still denied citizenship rights and members risk arrest and harassment if caught meeting together. We urge Eritrea to end the use of arbitrary indefinite detention, immediately and unconditionally release all prisoners of conscience and restore citizenship rights to Jehovah's Witnesses. Given the lack of improvement in human rights over the last 12 months, Eritrea's role in Tigray and Oromia and its continued negligence in addressing the COVID-19 pandemic, it is clear the Special Rapporteur's mandate remains essential. We urge the Council to ensure its renewal. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Jubilee Campaign.
Campaign and Human Rights Concern Eritrea thanks the Special Rapporteur for his report. The report shows that no tangible progress has been made in solving the ongoing human rights crisis in the country. The government has not implemented the ratified constitution or established a legal framework to protect human rights Enforced conscription for military service, including of minors, has intensified dramatically. It has not ended the practice of arbitrary arrest, indefinite detention, and enforced disappearance. It has not facilitated freedom of expression or established a free media. It has not stopped widespread violations of freedom of religion or belief. The government has extended its terror to Ethiopia's Tigray region, and Eritrean forces are accused of committing horrific human rights violations. They also destroyed 2 refugee camps and forcibly returned over 20,000 refugees. The remaining Eritrean refugees in Tigray are dying from lack of food, medicine, and health care, as supplies have been prevented from reaching them due to a blockade imposed by the Ethiopian military and its allies, including Eritrean forces. Thousands of lives are at imminent risk. Despite being member of this council, nothing has changed in the government's attitude. The council cannot relax its scrutiny through the special rapporteur. It is essential that the mandate remains in place. Thank you.
Thank you. I invite the representative of East and Horn of Africa Human Rights Defenders Project to take the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Mr. Special Rapporteur, your report provides compelling evidence of ongoing grave violations in Eritrea and atrocities Eritrean forces have committed in Tigray. In some areas, the situation has deteriorated. As you write, Gifa has dramatically intensified, and conscripts have been forced to fight in a gruesome war. Refugees who are living in Tigray were kidnapped and forcefully returned to Eritrea. Some of them have been forced to go back to Tigray to fight. As Eritreans are trapped in cycles of poverty and vulnerability, and the right to education is severely affected, the government refuses to meaningfully cooperate with the UN human rights system. Eritrea remains among the very few countries that have never received any visit by a special procedure. Mr. Vice President, after the former sponsors of Eritrea resolutions decided to drop their initiative based on reasons unrelated to human rights, we welcome the initiative that 6 states took to maintain scrutiny of the country. We believe it's now time for the Council to move beyond procedural resolutions and to clearly describe and condemn violations Eritrean authorities commit. The Council should extend the Special Rapporteur's mandate and enshrine the benchmarks for progress, as well as recommendations made by UN bodies and mechanisms which form a roadmap for reforms. Thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of CPTI.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Conscience and Peace Tax International thanks you for your report, Dr. Babika, particularly your update on forced recruitment, indefinite military service for both men and women, and deployment of child soldiers, and for mentioning Eritrea's continued failure to recognise the right of conscientious objection. After last year's report that 3 Jehovah's Witnesses imprisoned for refusing call-up in 1994 had at last been released, other conscientious objectors still remain in detention. Hinuk Gibru for over 17 years since the 1st of February 2005, Yusuf Fesehaye since 2006, Samuel Girme since 2009, Berket Habdiyesus without charge since 2014. CPTI calls on Eritrea to restore lawfulness to military recruitment, conscripting only through orderly procedures and for no longer than the 18 months stipulated by law, and by instituting a genuinely civilian alternative for conscientious objectors. And we call on you, Mr. Special Rapporteur, to continue to monitor this issue closely. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Civicus, Worldwide Alliance for Citizen Participation.
Civicus on the Eritrean Movement for Democracy and Human Rights welcome the work of the Special Rapporteur and his latest report. Despite its re-election for a second term as a member of the Human Rights Council, the situation of human rights in Eritrea remains of the utmost concern. The civic space is closed with no free and independent press, and at least 16 journalists have remained in detention without trial for about 2 decades. There is a culture of impunity for the perpetrators of human rights violations and abuses, including arbitrary and incommunicado detention, inhumane and degrading treatment of Eritreans through torture, forced labor and sexual violence, religious and ethnic minority oppression, denials of the rights of free expression and peaceful assembly, and escalating conscription of youth in the national army, compounded by increasing militarization of the country. The Special Rapporteur identified benchmarks for human rights progress in 2019 to address these concerns, but the government has so far refused to engage on their basis. Eritrea's continued lack of cooperation with Council mechanisms, as well as other UN agencies, undermine the implementation of their activities and programs. We urge the UN Human Rights Council to renew the mandate of the Special Rapporteur through a resolution which reflects the gravity of the situation and enshrines the benchmarks for progress. We further call on the government of Eritrea to fully cooperate and allow access to UN Human Rights Council mechanisms. We thank you.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Center for Global Non-Killing.
Dear human beings, Mr. President, Mr. Special Rapporteur, dear delegation of Eritrea, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, greetings of peace and understanding. To found and to lead a nation is an extraordinary opportunity. Be it through a process of self-determination, a constitutional process, a change of government, or for any reason. However, the past is never as important as the future. Theory of change is not about shame, blame, or accountability. Hoping these are never needed. It is not either about double standards, the UPR, or country mandates. It is about making for ourselves a difference, a betterment, a change, but that is valid for all. The Enlightenment philosophy used to say, quote, the greatest good for the greatest number. The philosophy of human rights spells differently, sufficient good for all, each and everyone. We know there are problems everywhere, and in Eritrea. They are listed, and in Dignity we regularly engage on Eritrean issues. We know there are solutions everywhere. They are to be created and used. The tools of development, of peace, respect for life are available to each and all. We are waiting to see them used and to see a brighter future for the people and institutions of Eritrea, now and everywhere. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank you. I give the floor to the representative of Human Rights Watch.
Thank you. As repression in Eritrea shows no sign of abating, we welcome the Special Rapporteur's report. Since last year, the government has taken no steps to end its widespread forced labour and conscription, and it continues to severely restrict basic freedoms and obstruct independent scrutiny. As spelt out in the Special Rapporteur's report, individuals continue to be held incommunicado and detained indefinitely, some for decades. September marked the 20th anniversary of the government's arrest of 11 government officials who had called for political reforms, and 10 prominent journalists. At least 10 are reported to have died in detention. People have once again been detained purely because of their religious beliefs. In February 2022, Abun Antonius, the deposed Eritrean Orthodox Church patriarch, died while under house arrest, which he had been subject to since 2007. Since war broke out in Ethiopia's Tigray region, we have received reports of mass waves of roundups of Eritreans to fill the army's ranks. This continues to drive flight from Eritrea. Eritrean forces in Tigray have continued to commit serious violations, including mass arbitrary detentions, as well as pillage and rape of Tigrayans in the Western Tigray zone. Eritrea's Human Rights Council membership has not led to greater respect for international standards, nor implementation of key recommendations made by the Council's procedures. We call on the Human Rights Council to extend the Special Rapporteur's mandate and call on Eritrea to cooperate with the Special Rapporteur. I thank you.
Now I give the floor to the representative of Centre d'études juridiques africaines.
Mr. Vice President, Special Rapporteur, ladies and gentlemen. Just as the Special Rapporteur of the African Center for Legal Studies, ACLS, is seriously concerned by the human rights situation in Eritrea, My organization continues to stress that the involvement of Eritrean forces in the Tigray conflict, theater of a deadly conflict, has extremely negative impact on the protection of freedoms and fundamental rights. According to certain reports, war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity were committed. Despite the preparation of a program by the WFP on 1st April 2022 and a creation of International Commission of Experts on the Human Rights situation in December 2021, something that my organization welcomes, the ICLS, I'd like to stress that violations of human rights continue, especially collective rape, extrajudicial executions, and obstacles to the provision of humanitarian assistance. Many of these violations are committed by the soldiers of the Eritrean army. The ICLS urges the Eritrean government to respect the legal international instruments that the country has ratified, especially international covenant related on political rights, the Convention Against Torture, the African Charter on Human Rights. Also, we would like to ensure full cooperation of Eritrea with the UN mechanism related to human rights and the effective implementation of the results of the UPR from 2019, the meeting of the Committee on Human Rights in 2019. Thank you very much.
I give the floor to representative of ARC.
Mr. Babikar, the military presence of Eritrea in the Tigray region is a clear violation of international law and the UN Charter. And yet, despite the extent of grave, gross and systematic human rights violations requiring the yearly extension of your mandate since 2012, Eritrea was twice elected as a member of the Human Rights Council. As a member, Eritrea has failed to implement your recommendations and those of the Special Rapporteurs preceding you, those of the Commission of Inquiry, CEDAW, and other treaty bodies, as well as those accepted in the UPR cycles. Eritrea has used its membership to oppose international scrutiny over violations, the withdrawal of its troops, and the establishment of an international commission of experts to investigate allegations committed by all parties to the conflict. Eritrea has taken this approach in connection with many other resolutions opposing gross human rights abuses in many other countries as well, including the human rights situation in the Islamic Republic of Iran. Mr. Babikar, given the extent of human rights violations, the persistent disregard for all recommendations given to this day, and no indication of any will to change course, would you not deem it appropriate and judicious to recommend the suspension of the country from the Human Rights Council based on the Resolution 60-251? Thank you.
I thank you. This was the last speaker on the list. I now give the floor to Mr. Babike for responding to the questions and for his concluding remarks.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And thank you for the questions raised by members of the Council and Member States. Regarding some questions, I would like actually to respond to the question related to by Australia about the engagement of the Special Rapporteur with the Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia and the investigation. Actually, I look forward to engage with the Commission of Human Rights Experts on Ethiopia, and while my mandate is separate and distinct, however, there is a scope of cooperation between the two mandates. I also foresee that there is a mutual interest, for example, regarding the violations committed against Eritrean in Tigray, which is actually part of my mandate. And I think there is a space of cooperation and engagement and exchange of information. This actually has to happen, but with in terms of it has to take place within the limit of my mandate and within and according to the conduct, the code of conduct of a special procedure. And also bearing in mind it has to be done according with consent and also confidentiality of sources. And actually mentioning that, I would like to mention that some member states mentioned that I exceeded my mandate and I would like to refer to this point, which is actually raised it in my last report last year. I mentioned that I did not exceed my mandate because protection of refugees in Tigray or protection of refugees in other neighboring countries, like in Europe or in Sudan or in Egypt or in Libya, or also protection of refugees even in the diaspora. It is part of my mandate because the violations actually committed against the Eritrean nationals, and this is part of my mandate. Also, the violations committed by the Eritrean troops in Tigray, they have an effective control, and under international humanitarian law, extends beyond the territorial country, and because the Eritrean forces, there is evidence, I put it in my report this year and last year, of control of certain parts in northern and western part of Tigray. There is effective control of the Eritrean forces. So I have a mandate in order to monitor the human rights violation in the country and beyond. Regarding the question raised by to what extent how the international community can assist my mandate in monitoring human rights violations in Eritrea in order to improve the situation, I want to thank member states who actually showed their interest to support my mandate. One of the most important action is actually to encourage the government of Eritrea, to encourage the government and the authorities to engage with my mandate, and to allow me to conduct a visit to the country. Many countries here spoke about constructive engagement. I need to engage. And actually, on this point, I reached many times, as I put it in my report. I requested a visit last year in January. I visited in August. I shared my report with the Eritrean government on 26th of April before the report is published. I asked for the review and their comment, but they didn't respond. Even they didn't respond to my correspondences. So I appeal to this council, and for those countries who are actually asking about constructive engagement, they should actually consider this, because the mandate is created by this council, it's not created by me. And this is the responsibility of the council, is actually to exert pressure on the government of Eritrea to cooperate. And I would like to stress this point. And also I would like to mention that non-cooperation by a member of the Human Rights Council, it is also jeopardized, as I mentioned in my statement and mentioned in my report, is actually jeopardizes the integrity of this council. Because I believe this is a human rights council, and the Human Rights Council, part of its mandate is actually to defend human rights. And I think this is part of the integral responsibility of this council to provide such a support. And I hope this will actually, member states who are actually opposing my mandate and opposing extending the mandate is actually to take this point. And I hope that as the Eritrean authorities, I reach out to them, and I regret that they did not give me the opportunity to visit the country. Even they did not give me the opportunity to meet them here in Geneva. I actually requested last month to meet the government here, to deal with them, to have exchange with them. And from the region, I know the issues, and I know the dynamics, and I'm really willing to engage with the country for the benefit of the Eritrean nationals and also for the benefit of the country itself. Because human rights are actually global values and need to be respected. And I really now, with the presence of the delegation of Eritrea here in the Council, I really appeal to them to engage constructively and even to comment on my report. I need to have access, and I need also to deal with them in these issues. So I think it's really important to establish a channel of communication with the government in order to improve the mandate. And this also works better for the Human Rights Council itself, because you cannot issue a mandate, you cannot issue a resolution for the resolution not to be implemented. And I would like also to know that I'm an independent from any state. I'm an independent rapporteur. I don't receive any instruction from any government The issue of politicization, it's the politicization on the Council, the Human Rights Council. I'm not politicized. The Council itself is politicized. If you look at the statements from Russia, from Cuba, from Venezuela, from Iran, and then look at the statements from the US, from the UK, and from Ireland, from other countries, you can see the polarization. It is political polarization of the Council. It's not the political polarization of the Special Rapporteur. So I would like actually to help me in this mandate in order to be able to improve the human rights situation in the country. And there's a question about investigation. How can this? There is no progress made regarding the human rights violations. And this question raised by Switzerland. I would like to mention that the victims of human rights violations committed in the national service should actually have access to justice. And also, I believe that there should be a reform in the national, the proclamation for the national service, 1998. It has to be reformed because the military service in Eritrea is actually indefinite. It is supposed to be 18 months, but now people are actually in the service for 20 years. So I hope that this will be an issue that Eritrea, to be able to reform its own justice system. And I hope this will be done because courts there are not independent. There is no due process of law, and there is no any information that regarding there is no any conviction of judicial processes against Eritrean officials who are actually accused of committing violations like sexual violence or conscription. So there is no any mechanism, and I hope this it will help any investigation regarding the violations committed in the country. There's also a question regarding how the international community can a member state assist my mandate, and also assist human rights defenders and civil society organizations. I would like to mention that member states should actually urge Eritrea to adopt some measures, most importantly to hold the persecution, criminalization, and torture of political opposition, civil society and media groups and faith groups, and also the practice to end the practice of arbitrary detention. And this policy must be must be stopped, and prisoners must actually be released. Also, one of the support to the Eritrean in the diaspora, there is a huge community from the Eritreans are actually in the diaspora, left the country, and diaspora community can be supported, to have access to them to support victims in the diaspora, outside Eritrea, and also ensure that Eritrean in the diaspora are protected, and also in this respect I need to actually commend the work of the Eritrean organizations and activists who actually face enormous risk when actually they raise and they cover and they address the human rights violations committed in the country. I would like just to, finally, I would like to say and would like to mention that I hope members of this council to help my mandate. I appeal, I urge the government of Eritrea to open its doors, to engage formally or informally, and I'm willing to support the Eritreans for the benefit of their, and support their human rights. I thank you. Thank you.
I wish to thank Mr. Mohammed Abdel Salam Babikir for his participation. This is bringing us to the end of this interactive dialogue.